Okay, so we are going to cover chapters 7 through 10. So basically the rest of the book here in the next few minutes. This chapter starts out talking about Jason Giambi, and some of you will undoubtedly remember him. He started with the A's, was very successful, became a superstar with the A's, and like most of their free agents, they were not able to keep him once his rookie contract expired. So the A's took a specific approach to trying to replace Giambi. They did not go out and look for another superstar player to fill his spot in the lineup. Instead, they thought about him in terms of what he represented by on-base percentage and how that related to the on-base percentage of their team in general. So what they tried to do is upgrade a few positions that, together with the replacement that they could afford for Giambi, would replace in the lineup his on-base percentage. They also had to replace, keep in mind, Johnny Damon, who we talked about at the end of the last video and chapter. Did not have a extraordinarily good on-base percentage. It was more in Damon's case of replacing his fielding. They went out, they got David Justice, who was certainly beyond his prime at that point. They got Scott Hatteberg, which we'll talk more about in just a few minutes. He plays a big part in the Moneyball story. And they also got Jeremy Giambi, ironically Jason's brother, as one of the replacements or upgrades, if you will, / replacements to try and replace Jason Giambi's on-base percentage. So why is Jeremy Giambi playing left field? You know, that question doesn't make any sense if you haven't read the chapter, so you need to go back and read it if you don't understand that question. But Jeremy Giambi's not a left fielder, and the A's put him in left field. They do this a few different times throughout the Moneyball story, throughout the book, where they put players who are used to playing one position in a different position in the field. And the reason for that is, as they say in the book, it's the most efficient distribution of the A's resources. So the key word there is efficient, right? They're trying to be efficient with how they construct their lineup in terms of generating runs on the offensive side, and as much as they can, reducing the chance of the other team scoring runs, right? But their statistics have shown, and their analysis of those statistics have shown, that offense is more important than defense. There's more variation among teams in offense than there is in defense, right? So they can put a defensive person out there like Jeremy Giambi, who's a little bit of a liability. You know, he's trying to learn the position in left field, but you know, when he makes mistakes, and he will make a few mistakes, it's not going to be as costly as their other option for Giambi and the drop-off that would be in terms of on-base percentage in the lineup. They talk about baseball in this chapter, in chapter 7, as a war of attrition, and I thought that was a great quote for us to understand as it relates to the Moneyball scheme. And along with that quote, they say, what's being attrited, I don't know, how do you say that? Attrited is pitchers' arms, meaning what's wearing out here, attrition. What's wearing out is pitchers' arms. Well, what do they mean by that? You know, I don't understand how that relates to sabermetrics, you might think, or how that relates to Moneyball. They're not talking about their own pitchers, they're talking about the opponent's pitchers, right? They're trying to find hitters with plate discipline. And if you have more plate discipline, you can get more pitches thrown to you by a pitcher. And if everybody in your lineup holds that same discipline, then that starting pitcher's throwing more pitches to get through, to cycle through the lineup and get through more outs, right? The more pitchers that starting pitcher throws, the more likely that he is to be replaced by a reliever earlier in the game. And relievers are not as good as starters traditionally when it comes to pitching. So if you get to the reliever earlier in the game, you're forcing more relief innings, and theoretically you're scoring more runs on those relievers. They also made this analogy of a plate appearance like a hand of blackjack, right? What's the story there? Well, if you've ever played blackjack, and I'm by no means an expert player of blackjack, but you know that as every card gets dealt or revealed, in the case of the dealer, the odds of you having a winning hand changes, right? Either gets better or worse with every card that's distributed by the dealer. And in that same way, the A's know that with every pitch thrown, the odds of getting a hit or getting on base, I shouldn't say getting a hit, they're concerned with getting on base, whether it's a hit or a walk or even hit by a pitch, by whatever means, the odds change with every pitch thrown. And what they find is the most important pitch in an at-bat, you remember what pitch that was? The most important pitch in any at-bat is the third pitch, because the difference in your odds between 1 ball and 2 strikes and 2 balls and 1 strike, the difference in your odds of getting on base are pretty large, that spread. So that third pitch is so important. Related to that discussion about plate discipline and how baseball's a war of attrition and what are the most important pitches in an at-bat, it's all based on having disciplined hitters at the plate in your lineup. And Billy Beane learned something during this whole experiment. He learns that discipline can't be taught, or at least that's how he perceives it. Why does he come to that realization? Well, he finds that despite the fact that they've worked hard, the A's have worked hard to implement a system of plate discipline throughout their farm system, that the A's hitters at the major league level with the most plate discipline were acquired through trades, while the hitters from their own system, that came up through their minor leagues, were less disciplined. So that makes Billy think that it can't, that this discipline can't really be taught, that it's more of an innate trait, which leads him to be even more aggressive about taking over the draft, right? And we've already talked about that, how he took over the draft to ensure that they would get disciplined hitters from the start, right? Another odd thing about Billy that comes through in the movie as well is he doesn't watch games live. He's usually down working out in the clubhouse while the games are going on. Why? Typically when you watch a baseball game, you see Theo Epstein in the crowd, or you see, the general manager in the crowd. Why doesn't Billy sit up in the luxury box or sit in the crowd and watch his players? When you think about it, it really makes sense once you hear his rationale. He doesn't believe in the eye test, right? He believes in the statistics and the numbers. So he's worried that if he watches the games live, he's going to become subjective or more subjective instead of being objective. Meaning that eye test is going to start to influence him. So he doesn't even watch the games live, right? He just looks at the box score. He looks at the numbers. Now back to Scott Hatteberg for a second. He fits the A system pretty well, right? He plays a big role in the movie, gets a whole chapter in the book, chapter 8. What makes him such a good fit for the A system? Well, he doesn't strike out a lot, right? But yet at the same time, he's not afraid to hit with 2 strikes on him, right? So he's got kind of that unique combination of plate discipline where he takes lots of pitches, but he will swing at good pitches when there's 2 strikes on him, right? He's not afraid up there. And he also doesn't swing at pitches that he can't do anything with, right? Meaning it's a pitch that if he swings, at best he fouls it off, maybe, if he knows it's a strike, he's going to just try and foul it off, right, and get a better pitch next. But if he's unsure whether it's a strike or not, and he knows he's not going to be able to do anything, meaning get it in play, if he swings at it, he just doesn't swing and takes a chance that maybe it's a ball, and a lot of times it is a ball, right? So he wears out pitchers by taking so many pitches. And that fits right into the A's system. Whoops, yeah, okay. So moving on to chapters 9 and 10 here. They give us kind of a season perspective in chapter 9, and they talk about how the A's are a different team after the All-Star break. But before we get to that, let's think about what Billy's trying to accomplish at the start of the season. What's his goal when he starts the season? Is it to put a World Series team out there, or a playoff team out there on opening day? Not necessarily. He doesn't feel like he has the money to do that on opening day. What he's trying to do is just stay in contention, not get too far behind before the All-Star break. And the stats show during the time period of this book that the A's play like a different team after the All-Star break. Why is that? Why would they be so much better after the All-Star break? Well, it's because they are a different team. Billy has such a keen mind for the labor market in baseball that he realizes that the labor market's going to change throughout the season, right? As teams perform poorly and they are out of contention, they don't want to carry as much salary a lot of times, so they make players available. Well, as more players are made available, it changes the price of players in the labor market, right? Because the supply of players has changed. The demand also changes in the labor market. Sometimes the demand goes down a little bit because there's less teams in contention the further you go into the season, right? So supply is going up, demand's going down. Guess what? Prices are going down. And Billy knows that, right? He says that change is always good. If you've got a pretty good team already, why would change always be good? Well, he knows that this is a competitive business, right? And if you don't change and you remain at the status quo, other teams are going to make changes. And if you stay at the status quo, those other teams are going to catch up to you, right? Billy does some interesting things to try and exploit the labor market and make these changes, right? Well, what does he do to exploit the labor market? For one thing, right, we talked about this before, he uses the value of relievers in the marketplace to get his team some extra cash, right? He takes mediocre pitchers, puts them into the relief role where they can rack up saves, and then he sells them off because he thinks saves as a stat is overvalued. That's one thing. But in this chapter it talks about how he manipulates teams that are seeking the same player as him by offering minor league prospects at that same position, right? So he knows that another team is maybe going after a third baseman. He knows the A's are also going after a third baseman. He will go to that team that he's competing with in the labor market, and he'll offer him a pretty good third base prospect and try and get him to bite on that, right? And then that reduces their need for a third baseman, and it changes the price of the third, what the third baseman's cost in the marketplace if one of the competitors for that labor drops out, right? One of the teams drops out because now they have a pretty good prospect at that position. Another thing he does is he tries to insert himself into insert himself into trades and make it into a three-way deal, right? Where he can sort of, through his keen negotiating skills, pick up a good bargain in the middle of a three-way trade. He does that with Weaver, going from the Detroit Tigers to the Yankees. He inserts himself. He tries to do that with Cliff Floyd when he goes from the Expos and was going to go to the Red Sox. Billy Beane tries to get Youkilis, they talk about. But in that particular case, it doesn't work, right? Because what does he run into? Somebody who's pretty famous now for also using sabermetrics. He runs into Theo Epstein, who at the time is the assistant GM for the Red Sox. And he realizes how valuable Youkilis is, according to sabermetrics. And of course we know Theo Epstein goes on to the GM role, wins World Series for the Red Sox, then goes to the Cubs, wins the World Series for the Cubs, right, as GM. So he really makes sabermetrics work in a little bit different situation where they have a little bit higher payroll, right, at both those teams. Also, they mentioned ESPN's Peter Gammons. Those of you that are big baseball fans will remember Peter Gammons as being kind of the lead baseball reporter for ESPN. Billy doesn't like to talk to reporters, but he will talk to ESPN's Peter Gammons. Why? Well, that's hats off to Peter Gammons, basically, because Billy realizes that he's such a good reporter that sometimes Gammons has information that Beane doesn't yet know. And so he'll make a little trade with Peter Gammons. You know, he'll say, hey, you tell me something that I don't know, and I'll tell you something that you don't know about what we're trying to do, right? But in general, Billy doesn't like to talk to reporters because they don't know anything more than he knows. So in Billy's mind, that's a waste of time. So related to this Peter Gammons idea is the second question here from Chapter 9 about the trading desk and manipulating players. So how is a GM's role like a trading desk? Keep in mind that the writer of this book, Michael Lewis, used to work on a trading desk, was a stock and equity trader. Well, at a trading desk, whoever has the most information is able to make that into money, right? Turn that into profit. So information is very valuable on any trading desk, right? And that's where Peter Gammons comes in. Our question from the last slide, you know, is Billy's trying to get information. The first question here, why does Beane dump Jeremy Giambi? Well, you know, as much as Billy tries to stay objective, you know, everybody loses their temper sometimes, right? Everybody gets frustrated once in a while. Billy's pretty mad about how poorly the A's are playing, and he takes it out on Jeremy Giambi, who's previous to that had some off-the-field troubles, smoking a little weed, hanging out at a strip club, drinking on the team flight, right? And Billy's like, forget it, I'm tired of dealing with this guy. Even though he's putting up some pretty decent sabermetric numbers, he takes it out on him, and he gets John Mabry, who actually turns out to be a pretty good pickup for the A's. Also relating to this idea of the trading desk and what Billy's trying to do in the free agent labor market, why is he interested in all-stars with expiring contracts? You know, that seems a little bit strange at first. We know the A's don't have money to keep these players, so you know, why go after all-stars? It seems a little bit counterintuitive to the A's strategy at first. But you have to understand how the baseball market works, the labor market in its entirety. So losing all-stars via free agency leads to compensatory draft picks. This is part of what comes out of that blue ribbon panel that we talked about earlier in this book and earlier in the semester as it relates to the economics of baseball. So the league decides that they're going to award some draft picks to teams that lose all-stars via free agency, right, to help that team reload a little bit. This was an idea to help sort of close down the gap in payroll and who can afford what within baseball. Well, Beane works it to his advantage because he gets, you know, he picks up a few all-stars on the cheap from these teams that are looking to unload salary, and then their contract expires at the end of the season, so the A's only have to pay them for a few months, and usually not even their entire salary because their former team is willing to pick up some of that, and then the A's, you know, lose the all-star, but they get the draft picks that come with it. And we know how much the A's value draft picks and what they're able to do with them. So this last point here, Ricardo Ricon, he switches jerseys an hour prior to the game against the A's, meaning he switches teams, essentially. So Billy Beane trades for a reliever right before a game with the Indians. Can you imagine that? Imagine being a player. You fly, from Cleveland all the way out to Oakland, or maybe you're on a West Coast swing trip. And while you're there at the stadium, you get traded to the team you're about to play. And all of a sudden, you have to go out and pitch against your former teammates in a game. And just a couple hours ago, they were your teammates. I mean, that's pretty crazy. I can't imagine that happening in really any other sport. But in baseball, it happened. And then lastly here, let's talk about the creature, Chad Bradford. What's his story here? Why is he called the creature? Well, his father threw sidearm because his father had a stroke when Chad was a child. And so he taught Chad to throw sidearm. Or I should say, Chad kind of learned from watching his father about throwing sidearm. And then Chad was a mediocre pitcher in high school, and his pitching coach at the time just went ahead and converted him into a sidearm pitcher as well, just like his father. But it really affected the White Sox owned Chad Bradford's contract for a while. They drafted him, but they kept him in the minor leagues despite putting up some pretty good numbers. Why didn't they keep him in the big leagues? Well, again, it's that eye test, right? Even though he was putting up good numbers in the minors, they just didn't trust his statistics. They didn't think that his minor league statistics were a reliable predictor of major league success. But the A's felt differently, obviously. So they pick him up on the cheap, and he becomes a pretty good pitcher for the money for the A's, right? So just another one of those examples of the A's following their system and not the eye test. So there's this guy that comes up in this chapter 10, McCracken, and he's an unemployed paralegal. So what does he have to do with Bradford's story? Well, kind of like Bill James himself, McCracken's a big baseball fan. He's read James's work. Fantasy baseball is around by this point, and McCracken's playing fantasy baseball, and he's crunching a bunch of numbers. And he realizes that the pitcher shouldn't be accountable for hits once the ball is put into play, right? So what really matters for a pitcher is how many balls does that pitcher allow to be put into play into the field. Because McCracken finds no correlation one year to the next in any pitcher's ability to prevent hits per balls in play. So he's saying instead of hits, we should be looking at how many balls in play do they allow. And so a pitcher should really only be accountable for strikeouts, walks, and home runs, right? And he develops his own statistic, defense independent pitching statistic, DIPS, and Chad Bradford scores really high on that, right? And McCracken's part of the sabermetrics kind of online group, or I guess you could call them that, fans. And the A's pick up on this idea, and they buy into that. So this last question is really something that hopefully you've been doing as you've been reading this entire book, in terms of thinking about, okay, this is what happened in baseball, years ago now, of course, quite a few years ago. Other teams have sort of bought into sabermetrics now, but it's still not as widely used as you might think. There's still a lot of people that resist it. So hopefully you've been thinking about, okay, we're learning about baseball, but how does some of these lessons apply outside of just baseball, right? And this last question is about that, what's the problem with any self-populating institution? And by that I mean any institution or industry where the people in the industry remain, they kind of fill positions and move themselves around within the industry, and not a lot of people from outside that industry come in to bring fresh new ideas, right? Self-populated, meaning you're filling positions from within people already in that industry, right? Well, as you've hopefully realized, one of the problems with that is that there's very little innovation, right? When there's not new ideas and new ways of thinking about things, the people that are in that institution become a little bit blind to some of their blind spots. No pun intended. I guess it wouldn't be a blind spot if you weren't blind to it. But it makes it hard for that institution to advance over time, right? And innovate as the environment changes, right? The environment changed quite a bit in baseball in terms of the ability to get statistics and analyze statistics, right? With computing power increasing exponentially in the 90s and then into the 2000s with software programs, statistical software programs. All of that's changed. Even now, eye tracking technology, right, is pretty common, where you can map out the whole field. There's just all kinds of innovations technologically that can be used now that couldn't have been used 20 years ago or even 15 years ago. So with a self-populating institution, you're not taking advantage of those new things in the outside environment that could be applied to your own industry. And that's what the A's did, right? Is they got people from outside the traditional institution, starting with Sandy Alderson right before Billy Beane. Billy Beane was an insider, but very emotionally intelligent, right? He was able to see his own flaws and his own blind spots in terms of when he was a player, and then he could apply that as a GM, right? And of course, he went and got Paul DePodesta from outside of baseball. So that's something to keep in mind, right? Is you always want to be thinking about your own blind spots. Always think about, what can I learn from another institution or another environment that I might be able to apply differently in this different situation, right? And we're starting to see, Moneyball, of course, is a baseball story, but we're starting to see it applied in other sports as well. English soccer, it's been applied. Leicester City won the Premier League not too long ago, and that was the first Premier League team outside of kind of that top five that had ever won the title in the Premier League. And they were really fueled by sort of a soccer version of sabermetrics somewhat. Arsenal has one of those top five teams that's kind of been famous for trying to implement a form or a version of sabermetrics in soccer. In football, just simple things like, do we go for it on fourth down, right? Should we go for the two-point conversion? A lot of teams are still very conservative. They go with the conventional wisdom instead of what the statistics might tell them. There's some famous high school coaches that have decided to onside kick every single time and never punt, right? Which is a pretty extreme form. But if you ask them why, and if you YouTube search that, the coach that never punts, you can find his story, and he says it just doesn't pay to punt. The statistics don't bear it out, that it's worth the field position to give up the football. And other sports are sort of challenged to come up with better statistics, right, that are more indicative of actual performance on the field that leads to winning games, right? So I hope you've learned a lot from the book Moneyball. I hope that you'll continue to keep this sort of thinking in mind and what it means, both in baseball and in sports and even outside of sports. And we will wrap up the book there.